to have Simisha Pather-Elias presenting today. As you will have seen from the invitation to the seminar, Simisha is a senior project coordinator at Sustainable Energy Africa, working on a range of projects sort of targeted at strengthening the capacities of local governments to implement sustainable energy solutions. Her talk today is going to be about the South African Buildings Programme, which she'll tell us a lot more about during the actual webinar. The format for the webinar will be that Simisha will talk for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, leaving plenty of time for questions. So please do note down any questions that you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make for the end of the webinar, and also feel free to pop questions into the chat as we're going along, so we can keep a record of those if you want to pose your question in that manner. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Simisha, and thank you very much, Simisha, for agreeing to give this talk, and we look forward to hearing about this very interesting, I guess, plank of the sort of climate change response challenge. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Mark, for the lovely introduction. Yes, so I'm Simisha Pather, and I'm from an organization called Sustainable Energy Africa, and I'll tell you more about that. I'm just going to switch off my camera and put my slide into slideshow mode. My computer is just giving me a bit of it's a bit wonky at the moment, so apologies for that. Okay, so yes, thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to be able to speak at your event. I'm going to be speaking on energy efficient buildings and taking them to net zero carbon status, and in particular the South African Buildings Programme, which was a program that Sustainable Energy Africa supported 4 metros with working towards developing policies and bylaws for net zero carbon buildings. So this is quite a large topic, and I just want to say that there's quite a lot to discuss around the program, around city processes, the vertical integration, funding, the whole architecture of buildings, etc. Obviously, I can't go through all of that today. I'm just going to provide the basics. But if you have any questions, we can cover those aspects after the presentation. And yeah, so I believe there's quite a lot of space for the presentation. So before I get into that, I just want to let you know who Sustainable Energy Africa is. We are an NGO that's over 20 years old. We're based in Cape Town, and we support cities in South Africa, and more so now with cities in sub-Saharan Africa on sustainable energy. And we do that through building their capacities, helping them with research and technical support, facilitating and networking cities around the country and the continent so that they can share information with each other. And our broad areas of support are climate change action planning, energy poverty, sustainable mobility and transport, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. All right, so buildings is quite a key area in terms of reducing energy, or specifically in South Africa's context, electricity consumption and reducing carbon emissions. And you can see from this graph that buildings as a sector, although it's not formally known as a sector, buildings consume the highest amount of energy or electricity compared to all the other sectors combined. And not many people know about that because we just think of buildings as a building rather than a sector. But if you have to contextualize it in that way, buildings are a key area that needs to be considered for climate change mitigation. All right, so this is quite a big area that the world is working towards. The C40 cities, of which there are 4 cities in South Africa, made commitments towards zero carbon buildings performance. I'm not sure if you are aware of the C40 program or the C40 cities, but the C40 is a global organization or membership of the world's major cities, and they make up of the world's largest cities are members of the C40 program. They represent over 650 million urban citizens, and that accounts for 25% of the global GDP. So the C40 cities as a collective play a significant role in reducing carbon emissions from cities. So the C40 released a report called Deadline 2020 in 2020, and that report showed that buildings' energy efficiency represents a significant opportunity for cities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And since then, a program arose, which the 4 South African C40 cities are part of and committed to reducing emissions in buildings. And the 4 cities signed a declaration for net zero carbon buildings by 2030. And that is for new buildings that are getting developed. Okay. In addition to that, South Africa as a country decided quite a long time ago, actually, that buildings were an important sector. And since then, many policies have been developed at a national level. So this started off way back with the climate change white paper for the country. And since then, there have been progressive policies that have been developed for buildings. So linked to those specific policies for buildings, which include the building regulations, in 2011, the buildings regulations included an annexure for energy efficiency in buildings, and that is known as the SANS 10400 SANS 10400 XA, which speaks specifically to energy efficiency in buildings and the way that the buildings are designed in order to reduce the energy dependence of them. So I'll get more into that kind of detail in a bit. But I just wanted to say that there are lots of other policies which are linked and which support that building policy. There's policies on energy efficiency. The post-2015 National Energy Efficiency Strategy, for instance, has targets for all sectors, including buildings. There's the carbon tax. There's the NDCs, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, which has commitments for South Africa. And in those commitments, there's the wedges include energy efficiency for buildings. And then there's broader programs like the National Development Plan, which also speak to buildings. What this program aimed to support was policies and bylaws at the local government level. And in this particular case, it was the 4 metros, which are Tshwane, which is Pretoria, eThekwini, which is Durban, Cape Town, and Johannesburg. Those policies and programs are development, and a lot of that has got to do with building the capacity of cities in order for them to do this, setting up the processes within cities, because it involves quite a few departments now working together, not just those development management, which is responsible for buildings, but also spatial planning and bringing in the electricity departments and environmental departments in very closely. So our support on the South African Buildings Project was aimed at supporting cities with getting that capacity underway in order to first develop the policies and bylaws and then implement these bylaws. Okay, so there are national policies and standards for energy efficiency in buildings. I mentioned the SANS 10400 XA standards. What the C40 cities, these 4 cities are trying to do is, when it started out when this program was conceptualized around 2017, what the 4 cities committed to do was to advance the standards for buildings. So bringing the net zero carbon buildings targets closer and having that placed in 2030. So that was ahead of the what national government had in place. But since then, a lot has changed. The SANS 10400 was updated last year with more stringent standards for energy efficiency in buildings. And what the discussions are now is actually trying to align the national regulations with the local government, or these 4 city regulations, trying to bring them closer or trying to have them align to the date. Okay. This is just a graph which shows you in these 4 cities the emissions that result from the different sectors. So there's residential, commercial and institutional, which is government, industrial, and then there's transport. And for the first 3, those are heavily linked to buildings, because the meter for electricity consumption is linked to the building. So all that energy is energy that is consumed is allocated to the building sector. And you can see that it is the emissions for the 4 cities in these different categories are quite varied, but they're along the same lines, actually. The variation has got to do with population, the kind of economy that is functioning in that city, rather than cities not being not being as strict about energy efficiency. So this is the baseline from which cities are working from, and that's hopefully, if there is large amounts of compliance, these figures should change substantially in the next 8 years, so by 2030. Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, buildings are a big sector that needs to be considered for electricity reduction, especially now with load shedding. that we're experiencing, but also with regard to the greenhouse gas emissions. In the 4 cities that we are working with, buildings consume or contribute 36% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we say that that is only half the picture, because in the future, we, if the business as usual scenario actually plays out, where large amounts of urbanization and migration happen into these 4 cities, the building stock has got to increase to accommodate the people that need to live here. And if the business as usual scenario, which is the buildings are planned in the same way that they are currently, if that plays out, then the emissions is going to more than double. So that's what this graph illustrates. So in 2030, for these 4 cities, the emissions was just around 30 million tons of carbon, and by 2050, if no energy efficiency takes place, then we can expect that to be more than double at close to 90 million tons. Okay, so obviously we don't want that to happen, and you are very well aware of the impacts of climate change. So I'm not going to go more into this picture, except to say that it looks quite dire. Okay, so what is a net zero carbon exactly? Net zero carbon building exactly? So there are some variations around the definition of net zero carbon buildings. In South Africa's context, and with the building councils, and especially the Green Building Council of South Africa, a net zero carbon building is defined as a highly energy efficient building with all the operational. So when we say operational, we mean things that we can plug in, like your computers, your TV, etc., etc. But in terms of we talk of baseload energy and we talk of operational energy. So baseload energy is the energy that is required for lighting, for heating and cooling, so your heaters and air conditioners, and then for water heating. And then operational energy, else that you would plug into a socket, a normal socket. And we want the base load energy to be maximized in terms of energy efficiency, and that needs to be net zero by 2030, and all operational or any other energy requirements from that is then met by renewable energy. And that renewable energy can be renewable energy that's on the building, so rooftop PV. It can be from the grid, or it can be through direct purchasing through what we call a wheeling agreements, where a business or a building in particular can make a contractual agreement with a wind farm and have that electricity, in essence, wheeled to them over the grid. But the foundation of net zero carbon buildings is that they are ultra energy efficient, and that is the foundation. And in order for that to happen, buildings actually need to be designed in a completely different way than they are currently being developed. Okay, so that means that the architects or the designers of buildings need to actually use very different tools to what they are using now. So currently, architects use what we call a deemed to satisfy or prescriptive method, which is really like a recipe. You know what needs to be put together. Your windows, a building needs to have windows, it needs to have walls, it needs to have a roof. You put those all together using a recipe, and that is how architects design buildings. But in order for buildings to be energy efficient, as I mentioned, the base load, which is your lighting needs and your heating and cooling needs, as well as your water heating needs. The buildings actually need to be designed in a particular way that they maximize lighting, natural lighting, so that buildings heat up. Normally, they don't need that much of heating from other energy sources to heat up the building. When buildings are designed in our hemisphere, they need to be facing north-facing. Then they can make use of the maximum amount of sunlight. When that happens, your electrical lighting needs are reduced as well. And then for water heating, instead of geysers, the 2011 building regulations required that electrical geysers need to be substituted with alternative forms of water heating, such as heat pumps or solar water heating. So using very more, let's say, sophisticated tools to develop buildings, they can be designed in such a way that they make use of buildings that are orientated in the correct position to maximize sunlight. The building materials that are used are also very important, so that they provide a good insulation for the building. So that refers to the envelope of the building. There are also specifications for windows, window sizes, the type of and thickness of glass that is used, for instance. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. And these are the targets that an energy efficient building should have. So for heating and cooling, the range the target range is 10 to 30 kilowatt hour per square meter per year. So that is the metric that is used in buildings, kilowatt hour per square meter per year. For lighting, it's around or it's maximum 10 kilowatt hours. And I've just given an example of an office building. So for an office building, in general, it's going to be around 50 to 70 kilowatt hours per meter per year. But obviously, those depend on where these buildings are located. So as you know, in South Africa, we have very different climatic conditions, and that is taken into consideration when these targets have been formulated. And I will discuss that, those targets in a bit later. So in general, the metric that is being used is kilowatt hour per square meter per year, and we refer to that as the energy usage intensity. So it looks at a building as a whole, rather than what we used to do previously when energy efficiency first started out. You targeted certain interventions. So you looked at lights in isolation, you looked at heating in isolation, and you targeted those. What the new way of looking at buildings and how we're approaching it, or how we want to approach it in South Africa in the future, is look at buildings as a whole by using this metric of kilowatt hour per square meter per year. And later, I will also speak to you about the new energy performance certificates regulations that were promulgated recently and come into effect in a couple of months' time. So this graph shows you the different targets for energy consumption for buildings. So currently we are seeing buildings in the region of between 200 and 400 kilowatt hours per square meter. This is the national average. If you take all buildings, all sectors into consideration. And if there's good practice, so when we say good practice, it is taking behavioral considerations, factoring that in, which means switching off lights when you don't need it. When it's very cold, instead of using your heater, you use a blanket, adjusting your geyser temperature. Taking all those things into consideration, buildings can reach around 150 kilowatt hours per square meter. What we want to do with net zero carbon buildings is bring that figure down right from where we are currently now, which is somewhere around there, or for some of us who are very good, it's around there. We want to bring it down to this radical figure. Yeah. Okay, so that is, it's actually quite ambitious, and a lot of work needs to happen in order for that to materialize. Again, it just shows you the 10400 XA standard, which I spoke to about earlier, which are the building standards. In 2011, that was the target, and the new standards, which were developed last year, bring it down to about 90 kilowatts. That's on average for all buildings, but obviously they will vary for the different types of buildings and buildings that are in different climatic areas. Okay, so these are the kinds of targets which were worked on when we were developing the pathways for cities towards becoming net zero carbon in 2030. So this has changed a little bit since then because of the discussions with national governments, which is progressing. And as I mentioned, we're trying to align the city targets and national targets as well. But more or less, you can see that these are the different types of buildings here, the different categories of buildings. And then they are further categorized according to codes. And for those different types of buildings, initially the pathway that we were working on was by 2020. Say, for instance, we look at public gathering and entertainment buildings. The target would have been 80 kilowatt hours per square meter. The target for 2025 would have been even more stricter at 56. And then by 2030, it would have been 36 kilowatt hours per square meter to reach net zero carbon buildings. So you can see that as time goes by, the standards or the requirements become more stringent with increased amounts of or decreased amounts of energy demand for those buildings. And then by following 2030, some of the cities have decided they would tackle energy efficiency from now until 2030, and then post 2030, they would then start working on the renewable energy component to supplement and then bring in the net zero carbon status fully. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are current regulations called energy performance certificates for buildings. These apply to existing buildings. So I mentioned earlier that the net zero carbon buildings program is for new buildings that are getting developed at the moment and into the future. But we also have the existing stock of buildings which are consuming significant amounts of energy, and that needs to be addressed as well. So to address the existing buildings in the country, the national government developed the energy performance certificates. And what that means is buildings need to, by December of this year, they need to determine how much energy they are consuming. And then based on how much energy they are consuming, they get graded. I'm sure you've all seen this colorful scale on any new big appliances that you've purchased for your home. It tells you how efficient those appliances are. And similarly, this tells you how efficient a building is. So by the end of this year, buildings, and these apply to, at the moment, only 4 classes of buildings in the country. And it also depends on whether it's municipal owned or private owned. And it also depends on the size of those buildings. Taken all those criteria into considerations, these particular buildings will require these certificates, which means that they need to determine how much energy they are consuming, whether it's electricity or LPG or diesel or any other forms of energy that the building is consuming. They need to declare this to national government, who will store this information in a building's register. And they will also require to have this certificate, which they need to display on the foyer or the entrance of these buildings, so that it is publicly available. And the rationale behind having these energy performance certificates, so that they just inform everybody actually what the building is consuming, but there are no energy efficiency targets. And the reason for that is South Africa doesn't really have a very good idea of how much our buildings are consuming. So this is step 1 of forming a baseline for how much our buildings are consuming. And then using that baseline, we can actually develop targets which are realistic. So the targets that I showed you earlier, like this, there are similar targets at the national level in the SANS 10400 XA, but they've been based on a whim rather than informed by evidence. So what the EPCs, the energy performance certificates, will do is give decision makers and planners an idea of how much is being consumed, so that realistic targets can be formulated and can be worked towards that. Okay, and then lastly, so our work with the South African Buildings Project. So we worked with these 4 cities in conjunction with many other partners that we have had on the program. So we had the international partner. C40 wasn't just a funder, but they actually played a very strong role in supporting cities on this program. We also worked with the Green Building Council of South Africa, a company called Solid Green, architects So and Reap. We worked with national governments, so the DTIC, or the Department of Trade and Industry, is actually the custodian of building regulations. Worked with them trying to vertically integrate this program, so working at the different government levels, national, provincial, and local government. Worked through the various intergovernmental forums that are available, and SALGA, and using with all the partners, trying to support cities as much as possible in firstly developing the policies for net zero carbon buildings, and then thereafter to enact that by developing bylaws. So that work is still in progress. Our funding with C40 actually ended about 1.5 years ago, and we're trying to get more funding in order to provide more sustained support for the cities. But the cities have now taken it into their own hands and are spearheading and championing the work themselves. And we do hope that that does continue. So in terms of where the cities are, Tshwane had a building policy and bylaws. It was bylaws for green buildings, and that was done quite a few years ago. So they are just working towards accelerating or including net zero carbon policies into that green building policy. And they've got to go through the municipal processes in order to do that. And when that happens, they will need to do public participation with their residents and citizens and all their stakeholders in order to get that passed. With the city of Cape Town.
Time, Simisha. Sorry, just a reminder of time.
Okay, thanks. I'm almost there. With the city of Cape Town, their policy is within their recently adopted climate change strategy, and they are busy developing the bylaw, and then they will do public consultation. The city of Joburg is in the process or is going to be doing public participation soon. And eThekwini was actually ahead of all the other cities. They had their policy approved first. They did public participation in 2020. And they also have an incentive for buildings to be built in a net zero carbon manner before the bylaw gets passed and comes into place. And they have a 35% rate rebate for buildings that are net zero carbon. And I think that will come into or be implemented in the next year or so. So that is pretty exciting. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to say that there's a lot of work to be done with getting cities to develop those bylaws and implement them. And we're working with lots of role players in the space so that the program is sustained and the work can continue. So it really is a journey. And then I think this is my last slide. We've developed a website. I'll put this in the chat in a bit, but it's www.smartbuildings.org.za, and it's got all the information about buildings, in particular net zero carbon buildings, general information targeted for different stakeholders. So we've got the public, the professional industry and government as well. So if you want to find out more details about net zero carbon buildings, please go to this website. Okay, so that's it. And yes, I'm open for questions. So I'm just going to close this.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Simisha. Interesting. So I'm guessing that those working with the metros, the big cities, that's where most of the embedded and sort of carbon associated with buildings would be. Just before anybody else comes with another question, I may have missed it, but is all of this around new buildings, or does it also include sort of retrofitting or redesigning or trying to reduce existing buildings to some kind of net zero status here, and what are the different challenges there?
Yes, so the net zero carbon buildings, the target is 2030 for new buildings, and for existing buildings, it's 2050. So there's quite a big difference in that target date, and that's mainly around where once a building is built, it's actually very hard to change it unless you renovate it. So when buildings are renovated in which they will be like in the next 20 years, they will have to then renovate it to meet the standards for energy efficiency. Yeah. And then there's separate work for existing buildings with the energy performance certificates, as I mentioned.
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. I see Darlington's got his hand up. Do you want to go ahead, Darlington?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Simisha, for the presentation. I had a question similar to what has been asked now, but I think another one for me would be just thinking around the cost. What is the cost of doing that? Like really, I'm thinking in the context of competing demands, where, for example, you have very high demand for housing and human settlements. So how would you kind of balance that with those competing demands? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yes, thanks. Thanks for raising that. It's been something that is always raised, especially with developers. So we've done some calculations, and our calculations show that a net zero carbon building isn't really that more expensive to build than a regular conventional building like we're building now. There is a premium on that building, but it's really small. There are different mechanisms that can be put in place to reduce that premium. For instance, ABSA, which is a leading bank in South Africa on this and supporting net zero carbon buildings, they have an eco loan where they have preferential rates for buildings which are going to be net zero carbon building. That's obviously in this voluntary phase as we have now. When bylaws do get passed, they won't be voluntary, and but hopefully by then the market would have changed to bring that equilibrium in place. There's some other avenues that we are thinking of to bring in concessional financing from international funders to help the cities and developers with funding for those buildings. But I just wanted to say that there's a lot of green buildings around the world. There's a lot of green buildings in South Africa. Those are slightly more expensive than conventional buildings, but those buildings, so over time, over the life cycle, the buildings are on par with conventional buildings, or maybe even less, because the energy savings are significantly less, especially when we're looking at increased electricity rates into infinity. The other thing is that experience globally has shown that green buildings, people want to live in green buildings. They're nice to be in. They're thermally comfortable. So when the weather is like this today, you don't have to put in a heater to get some warmth. The thermal comfort is there naturally, and so people, whether it's for the residential sector or the business sector, they prefer to be in those kinds of buildings, and those buildings also fetch a premium in terms of rentals. They're more occupied. A very important question is for the affordable or for the low-income residential sector in this country. So the concepts that I mentioned earlier, we're trying to bring in concessional finance. We would like to target that concessional finance for the residential sector, specifically the low-income residential sector, and then very old commercial and industrial buildings where it's very hard or very expensive to retrofit to do those buildings. So there is work in that space, but in time, the market should dictate that those buildings would be quite affordable to everyone.
Super, thanks for that question. Any other questions for Simisha? I guess one of the questions is kind of debunking the cost side of it, because everybody thinks that doing something different might cost more. And when you did your costing, do you, particularly in terms of, I guess, shorter term, do you include sort of projections of what the cost of electricity might be if you sort of stayed on traditional sources? Because presumably that, yes, if you look at how electricity prices have sort of climbed in the last decade or whatever, that must be a significant factor in the cost of running a building, at least. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So all those, we model different scenarios with different electricity rates, different kind of renewable energy into the mix, different urbanization rates, all of that. So one thing that I forgot to mention with the costing is that for architects, it's in order for them to design buildings like this, they're going to need to re-look. It's a fundamental change in how they develop or design the buildings, and it means that they have to apply themselves a little bit more than they currently do, and they need to use newer tools in order to do that. So I mentioned earlier there's the recipe method, which architects use, and then there's also something called rational design. And rational design looks at building simulations in order to design buildings. So we're working with the tool with the World Bank, and that tool it's being used in other countries for rational design. We're working with them through the structures in South Africa so that our context, our standards, our climatic conditions, all of that can be basically to create a South African version of that tool, so that it's very easy for architects to then design these buildings rather than starting from scratch with nothing on the board. They can go into this tool, and it's very simple and easy to do, and it's also a free tool, and that will bring down the cost, the architect's costs, quite substantially as well.
Any other questions from our audience? I don't see any hands up. In terms of the regulations and sort of bylaws, is there work? I mean, is there anything happening on the architectural and design side to sort of certify sort of architects or architectural companies as qualified to sort of do this kind of work, or is that just going to happen almost by people self-training themselves? Is there anything to incentivize them on that side? Yeah,
it will happen by default. At the moment, everything is done on a voluntary basis. And so there are very few architects with the skills to be able to do this. But the Green Building Council does quite a lot of work with capacitating developers and architects in the sector. So skills do need to be built. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. It's not just the municipalities, but everyone involved in the construction industry. There's a whole value chain. I think there's something in the chat about the materials used for buildings as well. Yeah, everyone in the industry needs to be upskilled in order to do that.
Michelle, is your hand up about that, about Marika's question? Oh, sorry.
Yes, yeah, I just wanted to highlight the question in the chat.
Yeah, so the building materials are a very important consideration for thermal insulation and yeah, the building envelope. And there's a lot of work going on in the sector to specifically with cement to reduce the carbon emissions that are associated with the production of that cement.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the hour and I don't see any other questions, so maybe we should use this as the moment to bring the discussion to an end. And thanks, Simisha, very much for her presentation. Very interesting. It's always amazing to think of what the kind of, I don't know what the word is, but the sort of inertia in all of the systems that relate to energy use and carbon intensity and so on. It's such a slow process to shift these different systems and their regulations and practices. So hopefully the 2030 target will be met, but I look forward to hearing how we progress, how our metros progress towards kind of meeting those kind of targets. Yeah, so thanks very much. And yeah, I think to everybody else, enjoy the rest of your day, and yeah, don't burn too much carbon after this presentation. So yeah, thanks very much, Simisha.
Thank you.